Welcome to episode number 81 of the Blitz Take. I am here with Ryan Roberts, recapping week 12 of the college football and previewing this weekend's biggest games. So welcome.
Hey, Alex, how are you, man? Appreciate you having me on.
I'm good. How are you?
Good, man. Good. It's been a chaotic year of college football, obviously, and a lot of things to talk about. College football playoff rankings coming out tomorrow night, and it's going to continue obviously for the next couple of weeks. So appreciate you for having me on. I know it's a busy time of year.
What game stood out to you this past weekend?
I mean, so obviously I'm a little bit of a Notre Dame centric guy, right? So like obviously my coverage was kind of around, this past week they were playing a team that I thought was a little bit tricky in Virginia. They ended up obviously dismantling them 35-14. I didn't think Notre Dame played overly well, but I think the one game that really kind of drawn a lot of my attention outside of, obviously Georgia getting a big victory over Tennessee was the LSU game against Florida going down into the swamp. I thought was a very interesting one for a lot of different ways because obviously, coming into the game, I thought that most people predicted, and myself included, that LSU was going to go into the swamp and get a victory after two, tough losses in a row to Texas A&M and Alabama because there was a lot on the line going into the weekend. Obviously there's a lot of LSU fans that I think are losing a little bit of faith in Brian Kelly. I think there's a lot of LSU fans that are losing faith in Garrett Nussmeier at quarterback, and you really needed a bounce back game. But now, after the 27-16 loss, you're looking at what is the future of LSU football? How good can they be in the future? Is this a team that can be retooled and reshaped this offseason? What is the long-term outlook? So I thought the LSU Florida game was a very interesting game for a lot of different reasons other than just the 27-16 final score, obviously.
What were your thoughts on the Clemson-Pittsburgh game and Cade Klubnik's performance?
I thought Cade was really good in the first half, and then he fizzled in the second half. But I thought the whole team, just in general, fizzled in the second half. It wasn't a sustainable offense, obviously, what we saw the entirety of the football game because they weren't able to run the football. Like that was, I think, one of the things that you could have predicted a little bit of a step back in the second half of that football game offensively because they just weren't able to get any sort of a run game going. I mean, I think they ended up with like less than 20 yards rushing on the day. Like it was a really ugly outing overall. So the just the impact of that has negatively on a passing game to be just kind of a cohesive unit. I mean, there was just we always talk about, just kind of things working off of one another, right? To be kind of that extension of another. And when you don't have the run game going, the passing offense obviously was going to take a little bit of an uptick downward. So I predicted Clemson to win. I thought Pittsburgh would actually have a tough game. I did predict kind of a lower scoring game, but the fact that the Clemson offense just went so stagnant in the second half, it allowed, even with Pittsburgh with a backup quarterback and Nate Yarnell in, to just do enough to obviously get a victory. So I really think that it's a little bit of a trending downward. It's, we saw on Saturday that Clemson has talent, obviously, on both sides of the ball, but when you are a one-dimensional offense, you have a chance to let a team like Pittsburgh stick around in the football game, and they did just that.
Mm-hmm. What were your overall thoughts on the Tulane-Navy game?
Oh, I mean, Tulane, I think, it stinks that they have two losses under their belt because I do think that they have an argument as maybe the best group of 5 team this year. And obviously with the 12-game playoff and having the, automatic qualifier for the top group of 5 conference winner, I do think that Tulane is certainly trending in a great direction. Right now, obviously that would be Boise State that would make the 12-team field. But I mean, for me, I love the running back they have, Darian Mensah. He's only a redshirt freshman. He's a young kid who I think is going to get a lot of portal looks this offseason. A lot of schools I think are going to try to get him to enter and potentially be one of the big names in this portal conversation. But then you saw obviously Mekhi Hughes, the running back for Tulane, who's kind of a big bruiser type, been really good quietly this year. So I think Tulane, if something happens with Boise State down the stretch, or maybe they lose a football game they shouldn't, and you let Tulane kind of stick around and potentially grab that group of 5, group of 5 bid into the automatic playoff, I think that they could be a really tough team for someone in early stages of a playoff. So I think Tulane is a team that is trending very strongly upward.
I know that they are in the AAC championship game. What are your thoughts on that game?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, like, it's hard to bet against them right now. You know what I mean? Like, I'm big on the complementary side of offensive attacks. So, like, there were a couple games early in the year where I was watching Tulane, and I'm just like, they're a really good running team, especially early with a young quarterback. Mekhi Hughes is a guy, but I didn't think the passing game was quite up to par in a game or two. But then on the other side, it was like then when Darian Mintz was having his best game, I didn't think the running games showed up especially well. So I think if they have both things working, Mekhi Hughes is playing good football. Darian Mintz is playing good football. I think that they have a very good opportunity to potentially win a conference championship. And again, if they make it into the playoffs, while I wouldn't pick them to win a national championship or anything close to that conversation, I do think that they are a team that could be a really tough out early on in the playoffs. And I wouldn't be shocked if they were a team that could even produce a little bit of an upset at some point. So I think that they are a strong team that is very well coached, and I think that they are again trending upward in a very positive direction in the most important time of the year.
My next question is, what are your thoughts on Penn State and their accomplishments throughout the season?
I'm not a Penn State guy at all. So a lot of people have asked me about Penn State. It was just funny because I'm right here in New Jersey. And if you ask, like, I would say, I don't know exact percentage, but like there's a lot of Penn State fans around me. There is. Cause like there's not really there's obviously in Jersey, there's some people that like Rutgers, for instance, right? But like otherwise, like a big brands, Penn State is kind of the one that like kind of ruminates around here, for the lack of a better word. So there's a lot of Penn State fans. Here's the thing about Penn State. They always have talents. We know that they do well both from a recruiting perspective and they develop some positions really well. Others, I don't think they develop as well. But we can just look at the NFL draft, results from the last few years, and that Penn State has a lot of talent. And you can go on this roster right now. I think the left tackle Drew Shelton's a heck of a football player. I think they have two really good running backs, obviously Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. Katron's more of just a really good college back, maybe not as much of an NFL draft prospect, but you got Drew Aller, a quarterback. Tyler Warren, I think, is playing him into a first-round conversation at tight end. On the defense side of the ball, you have Abdul Carter, who I think is going to have an opportunity to maybe be the first not only edge rusher off the board in April, but I do think that he also has the talent to be the first overall player off the board. So you have those types of players. Tony Rojas is another guy at linebacker, Kobe King. Kevin Winston Jr., unfortunately, is hurt at safety, but he's another really talented football player. So, like, Penn State always has talents, and they're always going to have talents. I just am not a believer in James Franklin, to be very honest. I do think there's a little bit of deficiency both at wide receiver this year, and the offensive line, I think, is pretty good, but it's still a little bit of a inexperienced group, particularly at the two tackle spots, although I do like the left tackle, Drew Shelton, a ton. I just am not a believer in James Franklin. After the Ohio State loss, James Franklin's career record at Penn State against top 10 teams is 3-19, right? So obviously, like if we're talking about a team that is potentially going to get over the hump at some point, and I know they're ranked as number 4 team right now in the playoff ranking, it would be like the 5 seed if the rankings ended today, or maybe 6 seed depending on how the Big Ten shakes out. I do think that they are a team that's a little bit of a farce. I would not pick them to necessarily win a first round game just because I have no evidence to suggest that James Franklin could win a big game, even if it's at home. That 3-19 that I talked about in his top 10 games at Penn State, he's also 1-7 in Happy Valley against top 10 teams. So like he just has not got it done in the biggest games. And I just think that he's a guy that's going to kind of hold that team back a little bit.
What are your thoughts on the playoff picture? Do you see anything changing before tomorrow night's selection?
Things are changing. I think that for the most part, it's going to stick pretty soundly. I mean, obviously, the big thing is that the number 7 team in the country, number 8 team in the country, both lost, right? So we saw BYU get upset by Kansas. We saw Tennessee lose to Georgia. And I'm curious to see how far down Tennessee falls, because although Georgia obviously took control at the end, it was a very competitive football game for the most part in that game, and obviously Georgia was sitting at I think number 12 in last week's college football playoff ranking. So there's going to be some movement. Notre Dame, obviously, I expect to move up a spot or two. They were at number 8, so anytime that the number 6 and number 17 team loses in front of you, you expect them to move up a little bit. So I'm really just curious to see how the committee views that Georgia-Tennessee game. Because like I said, it was a competitive game for a long time. Obviously, it's a great win for Georgia, so I expect them to play themselves back into the field here after being the first man out last week. I'm more curious to see how they treat Tennessee, because Tennessee has been good for the most part. They have a couple very good wins, but obviously a loss at a tough part. So are they the first team out of the playoff bracket like Georgia was last week? I'm interested to see just kind of how that works out, because we're about to hit some madness this week. We've got Indiana playing Ohio State, the Big Ten just in general. It's going to cannibalize itself a little bit over the next couple weeks, and then particularly when most likely Ohio State's going to play Oregon again in the Big Ten championship game. But they are positioned so well with so many teams in the top 4 right now, top 5, that I do think it's going to be hard to keep out 2 to 3 Big Ten teams in like the top 6 schools or so. So interested to see how that works out, but I just really am curious to see how Tennessee is treated after losing to Georgia this past week.
My next question is, what were your thoughts on the Missouri-South Carolina game?
Missouri, South Carolina. Oh man, South Carolina is peaking at the right times. It's a shame. I think that for me, like, the South Carolina team was always really good defensively. Like, I mean, Kyle Kennard's playing on an outrageous level. Dylan Stewart's playing great level. They have the safety number 7, whose name I'm not going to butcher, Nick, but I'm not. Iwan Minori, I think is how it's pronounced, but don't quote me on that one. TJ Sanders. They have a lot. Demetrius Knight at linebacker. Their defense is stacked, and it always has been stacked. From the game 1, you can see like, oh, that South Carolina defense is nice. The problem is that I think the offense took a little bit a while to kind of find cohesiveness. They were a really good running team from pretty early in the season with Raheem Rocket Sanders coming over from Arkansas, and then their quarterback obviously is Lenora Sellers, sophomore, is a really dynamic runner. And we saw that very early on. You could pop in like the LSU game, for instance, and see Sellers before he got hurt is a dynamic weapon. And Rocket Sanders is very talented when he's healthy. But I think the problem is that it was very one-dimensional early on. Lenora Sellers was a very inconsistent passer. I just think the passing game was not up to par. But the last couple of weeks, Sellers is playing a lot better football. This passing game is starting to match the run game a lot. I just think it's a shame that they just offensively were not up to par the first 2 games of the year, because this could have been a playoff team. And I know that they're, obviously is still a good team, and they still have, some things to play for here, but I just think were a team that just kind of meshed a little bit too late into the season, but they are not a team that I would want to see down the stretch, because they play great defense. Their offensive line has been improved from previous seasons, and their dual threat quarterback along with Raheem Sanders has been fantastic. So obviously they won against Missouri, and Missouri is a team that on the other side of the spectrum has trended downward big time. Like we saw them have a tremendous double-digit win season in 2023, but the offensive line isn't quite as good. Brady Cook has taken a step back. The run game has taken a step back in general, and you had a lot of defections on both sides of the football. So in that game, I think it's a parallel of one team that's trending very strongly upward and another team that is unfortunately going down a bit just based upon the defections for last season.
My last question from this past weekend before we head into previewing this upcoming weekend. What are your thoughts on the Oregon-Wisconsin game?
It was weird, to be honest, right? Like, that was a strange football game. I only caught the second half because I was doing a post-game show, and I popped it on, and I had seen some commentary from like a chat that I'm in on Slack that like, oh man, Wisconsin's like playing a great football game, and this is a back and forth, low scoring affair. And I popped it on, and obviously Wisconsin had a chance at the end, but like it was one of those things where Braden Locke might end up being a good player for Wisconsin eventually, a quarterback, but like it's just not there right now, right? And like this Wisconsin team they're not in a place right now where they can move the ball consistently through the air without a run game. Like they just aren't. So you saw those deficiencies in that football game. It was a great effort. I mean, both sides of the ball, I thought both lines played a really good football game. Obviously, Mateo Uyunglele ended the football game with a fantastic interception to kind of, cap the game overall. But it was a really tough, hard-fought game. I think that we got a really good example of Oregon maybe taking a team a little bit for granted. I know that it was in Wisconsin, and Wisconsin obviously had the home field advantage and everything, but I do think that they took them for granted a little bit. So taking them for granted, I think, was not a great thing, obviously, because Wisconsin stayed in the football game for a long time. But at the end of the day, good football teams are going to have these games occasionally where they kind of overlook a team a little bit. They have to win a gutty, just ugly football game. And at the end of the day, Oregon won the game, right? So it raises some antennas. It raises some eyebrows to a degree, but overall they got the victory, which is all that matters in the end. So it was a great attempt at an upset by Wisconsin, but for Oregon, they blanketed the Wisconsin receivers down the stretch in the biggest moments. Mateo Uyunglele made the biggest play. I think that overall, you just saw that there is a talent gap between Oregon and Wisconsin, but Wisconsin played their butts off.
So moving on to this upcoming weekend, what are your initial thoughts on the slate and what games will you be keeping an eye on?
Well, I'll be covering the Notre Dame game, obviously, this week. Again, I got a little bit of allegiance to that one. So they're going to be playing in Yankee Stadium, their Shamrock Series game against Army. And this Army Black Knight team is – I'm writing an article about this right now. This is like – if we're just talking about on paper, the numbers that they are doing on both sides of the ball, they're averaging over 35 points a game. Offensively, they're averaging to let up just over 10 points a game. This is – kind of the best Army team on paper that we have seen since like the 1950s. Like it has been a crazy amount of time since we've seen a team that is like this efficient as a football team overall. So I'm just really interested to see, one, Notre Dame is playing good brand of football right now. Can they, all due respect to Army for a second, because I just said they're having a great year and one of their best years that they've had in a long time. But on paper, obviously, Notre Dame is a lot more talented than Army is, right? So, like, does Notre Dame just kind of take care of business? Do they not leave anything to doubt? Do they make a statement, obviously, on this nationally televised game in Yankee Stadium? Or is Army legit? I mean, because like Army's doing incredible things and they're undefeated, sitting at 9-0, but they haven't played obviously a daunting schedule up to this point. They haven't played a team as nearly as talented as what Notre Dame is, for instance. So I'm going to be really glued to that one. I think the two other games that I would say, one is I'm going to help cover the Indiana-Ohio State game as well. Look, man, you're going to Columbus now, right? If you're the Hoosiers, and Indiana is a great story. Undefeated, 10-0. Curtis Rourke is playing great football. A lot of the James Madison transfers, including Aiden Fisher at linebacker, have been just absolutely phenomenal for head coach Curt Cignetti. So is this Indiana team real? Like, because they haven't played the hardest schedule, but while they haven't played the hardest schedule, they are killing every team on their schedule. They are leaving no doubt outside of the Michigan game last week that was close, 20-15. So can they show that they belong in that upper tier of this conversation? Obviously, they're a top 10 team right now because they're undefeated and they've taken care of business. Can they beat a team like Ohio State? At Ohio State, I have my doubts, obviously. So want to see just how they stack up to them. And I want to see if this Ohio State team can start to show, because they've obviously, they're only sitting with one loss, and it was a hard-fought loss to Oregon. But there have been a couple of games where I've wanted to see a little bit more from Ohio State, right? Like that Penn State game. Put your foot on their throat and finish it, right? Like metaphorically speaking, like finish that football game on a higher note than just a one-score football game. So Ohio State, I think, is the most talented team on paper in all of college football. I want to see if they're a team that can really assert themselves on a team like Indiana that's coming in with a lot of confidence. And the last game I'd say is Florida. This past week, obviously, got a big victory over LSU in the Swamp. Well, they get a very good team coming to the Swamp this week again in Ole Miss. And Florida, I think, is a lot of confidence going into this football game. But Ole Miss now seemingly rounding into form as one of the more talented teams in college football. You have Jackson Dart at quarterback. You have Trey Harris at receiver. You have the defensive line of Jared Ivey and Walter Nolan and Princely Unamielen. Like, it is a crazy amount of talent. Chris Paul at linebacker. So can Ole Miss, who's ranked number 11 right now, can they continue their ascension to being a no doubt playoff team, or do they suffer a blemish on the record that knocks them out of the playoffs? Because they have to win from here out to make sure that they can secure a playoff opportunity. Can Florida play upset for 2 weeks in a row in the Swamp? I'm interested to see just kind of how that game works out.
Yeah, it should be interesting how everything plays out, especially this Saturday. And thank you so much for coming on, talking college football, and I'll definitely have you back on sometime soon.
Absolutely, Alex. Thank you so much for having me, man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.